What is cinematic and how do we achieve it? So first we're going to talk about the history of the term and how it is different today from what it was before YouTube and DSLRs came around. If you just came here to know how to achieve the cinematic look and don't care about all the history, you can go to this timestamp. At the end of the video you will be able to understand how to make your shots look more cinematic regardless of the content or context of your scene. Now without further ado, let's get started. Ever since Canon released the 5D Mark II back in 2008, more and more people got access to cameras with Hollywood-sized sensors and interchangeable lenses. This changed the filmmaking industry and created a new wave of filmmakers, including myself. It also changed a term that existed over 100 years ago, the term cinematic. Now the term didn't really change its meaning, it means the same thing as always, film-like or movie-like, but the way videographers start to use it created a whole second meaning to the term. Today, when most people talk about the term cinematic, they only mean one thing, the film look. The only difference is that a good film has a reason for every single thing you see or don't see in a frame. The color, the framing, the amount of background blur, etc. Everything is carefully placed to make the audience feel a certain way through visual language. It goes far beyond this shot looks cool or pretty. However, if someone searches on YouTube how to make my shots look more cinematic, he's most likely not looking for visual language. He's just looking for a way to make his shots look more cool or pretty. This is why the term cinematic B-roll is a thing. Now I can guarantee you there is hardly any visual language applied to 99% of the content titled cinematic B-roll. Now don't get me wrong, it might look awesome and even make you money, but if you do a breakdown of why each shot choice, camera movement or lighting choice are made, it is mostly for practicality reasons or to make the shot look more cool. So basically the goal is just to create an edit that is seamless without jarring cuts and transitions. Nothing more, nothing less. Now like I said, there is absolutely nothing wrong with this approach. If a lot of people like it and the client is willing to pay for it, why not do it? So there are basically two meanings of the term cinematic now. The traditional meaning, movie-like in all aspects of visual language, and the more recent meaning, movie-like in looks. So to understand how to make your shots look more cinematic, you just need to substitute the word cinematic for the word depth. So instead of saying, how do I make my shots look more cinematic, you can say, how do I create more depth in my shots? Film and video are viewed on screens, it is a flat medium. So there is no actual depth there, it is only an illusion of depth. So to make your shots look more cinematic, you need to create more illusion of depth. So how do you do it? For that, let's take a look at another flat medium, like drawing for example. A lot of concepts in drawing are transferable to film. Now let's say I want to draw a ball. How do I show the audience that it is a ball and not a circle? For that, we can use a shadow. Shadow tells our eyes that the object is not flat, because to create a shadow, you need to block light, and a flat object cannot block light. Well, at least not from the side. This is just one example of how a drawing technique can translate to film. Now let's take a look at 8 ways to create more depth in your shots to make them look more cinematic. One of the easiest ways to make your shots look more cinematic is to shoot with a shallow depth of field. Depth of field has even the word depth in it. Depth of field creates depth the same way our eyes do. If we look at something close to us, everything in front or behind it becomes blurry because we focus on the thing we're looking on. You can test it right now. Put a finger in front of your face. Close one eye and look at the finger. Now while you are focused on the finger, the background is blurry if it's far enough away from you. Now focus on the background and keep the finger in front of your face. You will see that the finger is now blurry. This is how depth of field creates more depth in your images and makes them look more cinematic. I will be making a video about focal length soon, where we cover the best ways to create shallow depth of field. Stay tuned for that. Another way to create more depth in your images and make them look more cinematic is by simply adding a foreground element to your shots. The easy way to do this is to shoot through a door opening or to use an over-the-shoulder, for example. In the video about focal lengths, I will go more in depth on this topic. Just like with the foreground, adding a background element to your shots can create more depth and make the shots look more cinematic. Now in most shots you already have a background unless your subject is fully filling the frame. However, if you create more distance between the subject and the background, you also create more depth. It is very hard to create a shallow depth of field when your subject is close to the background. Now this is a huge one. Simply by creating a contrast between dark and light, you create more depth. So for example, like in this shot I shot 8 years ago. The subject in the foreground is lit and visible. Then there is a dark midground which makes our lit subject stand out against it, followed by a lit background with other characters. Now this is far from perfect lighting, but it does create depth because of contrast between dark and light. Now it doesn't have to be the contrast between the subject and the background. It can also be contrast on the subject himself, like his face for example. By having a shadow on one side of the face, you tell the audience that the light is blocked by the other side, which results in a shadow, so the face cannot be flat. This is the same as the drawing example from before. There are also other ways to create contrast besides dark and light, like color for example. Just think of the popular orange and teal look. Those are complementary colors, which means they create a lot of contrast for one another. This can be done with lighting, but also just with the colors of the walls or the clothes that subjects wear. Now, even though I'm very much against using camera movement for the sole purpose of the cinematic look, I have to admit that it does work. We filmmakers have the power, unlike photographers and picture artists, to move the camera. This way we have the ability to create more depth by moving camera closer to the subject or around the subject, telling the audience that the subjects are indeed not flat. Now don't get me wrong, not every movement will create the same amount of depth. It all depends on the focal length, your scene and the type of movement, but it will make your shots look more cinematic if done right. I will be making a video about camera movements in the future and will cover this topic some more. Now I didn't know how to name this one, so let me just show you some examples. So let's say you want to shoot the exterior of a house. You can shoot it like this, or you can also shoot it like this. Now the first way seems very flat because we can only see one side of the house. The second way is way more depth because we see two sides. This can be applied to a lot of architecture. Basically, show more sides if you have the option. This also ties in with converging lines. This one is also applicable to drawing. It is the same as perspective drawing and using vanishing points. I will cover this topic more in an upcoming video about the 180-degree rule. Now this has nothing to do with depth, but works extremely well. Just using a wider aspect ratio in your film will make your film look more cinematic. A lot of films we see today are shot on a wider aspect ratio, so our mind automatically associates it with the film look. Now be aware, if you want to film it with a wide aspect ratio, you need to do so during filming and not in post, because if you just put black bars on top and bottom, you will compromise your framing. Most cameras nowadays have an option to turn on the aspect ratio guide, so you can see how your film will look before you get into post-production. Now, every single thing I just mentioned, if used correctly, will make your shots look more cinematic, but to really sell it, you need to use more than one. For example, you can use depth of field, with a background that is far away from your subject, with contrast between dark and light on the subject's face, with dark light contrast between subject and the background. Let's also add a foreground element, and maybe some movement. Now let's put some black bars on top and bottom, and here's your cinematic sandwich. And then we go from this to this. Now my channel focuses primarily on visual storytelling. The real art is to combine all the depth elements for cinematic look and let them serve a purpose for your scene and the story. All the things we learned today, if you apply them right, will make your shots look more cinematic. But don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean your shots are more cinematic, they just look more cinematic, if that makes sense. Basically, if you don't feel like your shots look cinematic enough, just try adding more depth elements. I hope you learned something new today, and if so, let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, consider smashing the like button and subscribing to my channel. Hope to see you all next time.